Good afternoon. We're about to start. Just to give you a little warning before we go beyond the camera. So, I believe all our tummies are full and satisfied after a delicious meal. I want to thank all those who participated in that. Very yummy and appreciated. A lot of hard work went into a feast, really. All right. Welcome to End It Now, seminar by Caitlin Musgrave on domestic violence. Last night, we were encouraged to break the chains that needed to be broken in our lives. This morning, it was about the least of these and who they are. This afternoon, it is called, Is It Safe? Let's make it a safe place. What do you think? So we welcome Caitlin back for her third session.
I'm so grateful to see those of you. Is this on? Okay, yeah. I'm so grateful to see those of you that have stayed, because this is where the rubber meets the road. This is the nitty-gritty stuff. This is the ugly stuff that we're going to talk about today. And I don't see any young children, but I usually give kind of a disclaimer and I say, hey, if you've got young kids here, you know what your kids can handle. I don't get graphic, but I do tell the truth. So if you're watching online and you're streaming, this is not pretty stuff. We are going to talk about the ugly, and if you have a young person watching or with you, you may want to save it for later. This is ugly. So if you would, I want to pray, bow our heads and pray that God will guide this time this afternoon and guide my words, because I am trying to pack in actually probably about like 5 or 7 sessions worth of content into 2. So if you will bow your heads with me. Dear Heavenly Father, I pray that you will guide our minds and our hearts, and that you will you'll give us the information that we need, that you will use me to speak your words, so that this church can minister to the broken and to understand the scope of the problem. Just be with us and send your angels here today. We love you. Amen. All right, so we're going to start with the scope of things. So just kind of a trigger warning, which I kind of already gave, that, some of what we're going to talk about is uncomfortable or distressing, because abuse is ugly in all of its forms. And this may not be a conversation for young children. One second. I just realized I had my wrong notes up. There we go. Okay. So this presentation, like I said, is actually a presentation of kind of like 2 separate ones. We're going to be dealing with 2 separate topics. I'm first going to talk about children in the church, and then we're going to talk about domestic violence, because no conversation about abuse leaves out the conversation about where it starts and the vulnerability of our kids. And I think we need to kind of face that. It's really uncomfortable, and if you haven't dove into it and you think you have a grasp on the risk that our children face, I can guarantee you do not. It is really ugly. Some of the stories that I'll be sharing in this presentation belong to myself and my family, and some belong to other women that I have walked alongside, but I've removed like the identifying details so that, they aren't targeted. All right, so let's start with some stats. Every 68 seconds, an American is sexually assaulted. Every 9 minutes, that victim is a child. 93% of child victims know their perpetrator. It is not stranger danger. Nearly 70% of child sex offenders have between 1 and 9 victims, and at least at least 20 have 10 to 40 before they're caught. About 1 in 10 children will be sexually abused before they turn 18. 63.8% of offenders had little to no criminal history prior to being arrested. Here's a little good news for you. 95% of sexual abuse cases is preventable through education, which is why I am so passionate about this. So identifying perpetrators is really heavy. And it probably leaves you asking, like, who are these people? And as one of the conversations I had just a few minutes ago, as I've been talking to all of you, is how do you know? How do you know who's who? And it's really, really hard. How do you find them? What do they look like? Most people think that you can spot a perpetrator, right? He's the creepy guy, the one that everybody doesn't like. But no, that's actually often not what perpetrators look like. More likely than not, they are the most charming and the most trusted individuals in your community. But like the statistics stated, 95% are avoidable due to education. So part of that education is actually learning what to look for. So Dr. Jennifer Schwarzer, she founded Abide, which if you're not familiar with, I highly recommend you check them out, abide.network. They are a network of counselors and coaches who help. You can apply. They provide coaching, individual coaching. We have programs. And Dr. Jen did her doctorate on trauma and abuse in the church. She's fabulous. So she developed this little acronym. It's really nice to remember. CHIN, or what's a perpetrator? They are charming. They're a hero or martyr. They're insular. And they tend to have narcissism. So charm. They are naturally some of the most charming people that you'll ever meet. You are drawn to them. So it is not the creepy guy that weirds you out. It might actually be the guy that you're like, this is the coolest person on earth. I want him in my Sabbath school. Not that everybody that's charming is dangerous, but they tend to be really good at turning the charm on. They tend to be kind of that hero or that martyr. Those are kind of two sides of the same trait. You know, they might be the person that's always running in and rescuing. They are the person that sacrifices. They are the person that's like, oh, another job, no one has time for it. I have time for it. Or, you know, they're playing kind of that martyr position where you kind of feel sorry for them because they've given so much, right? And they're insular. They have almost like a cult-like personality. They could be really passionate about a specific topic, a specific like doctrine, and they use that to kind of isolate you and split you from your community. And it can look from minor things to major things. It's just they draw you in. And then narcissism, you know, they really struggle to admit they have any faults. And they think they have the answer to everything. And when you meet them, they're highly successful. They have a list of, you know, these traits, we're looking at them going, oh, yeah. Those look kind of negative, but in reality, they blend in with our communities really well, and they're really successful individuals. They might be, you know, the person that achieves the highest rank in a company, or there was a case in Canada of a highly successful pastor of a very large church, and he was arrested. Turned out he and his wife had a ring of child abuse going on behind the scenes. So let's, you know, learn a little bit more about some of these traits. We've got narcissists. Well, what are they characterized by? Well, inflated self-importance. You know, the guy that knows or the girl that knows everything. They are it. They need a lot of admiration. And that's one of the things that they kind of get off of perpetrating, is because it's almost like a form of worship. You know, they want their victims to put them on a pedestal. And that's why they have the need for other people to be below them and to worship them. They're highly insecure. They often have troubled relationships. And I'm really sorry to tell you guys, but men to women, it is 2 to 1. There are more men that struggle with this than women. Narcissists are capable of feeling the same range of emotions that we are. They just struggle with empathy because they're so self-centered that they don't know how to put themselves in your shoes. So maybe they feel sadness and they feel anger and they feel hurt, but they don't know what it's like to for your anger and hurt and pain. Narcissists come in several different flavors. You've got the overt, the covert, the communal, the antagonistic, the agonistic, and the malignant. Now, some of these, like the overt and the malignant, they're easier to spot. Like someone that's just cruel, that's a malignant narcissist. And you're like, oh, I know that one. But the covert and the communal, these are harder to spot because oftentimes they look like they're actually really good. An example might be the guy that is telling you all about how he paid for and rescued several of these domestic violence victims. And you're like, whoa, that sounds really good. And it is a good thing. But the reason he did it was so that you would pay attention to him. And all he does is go around bragging. He doesn't talk about them as people, you know, their pain, because he doesn't empathize with their pain. He's bragging about what he did. Oh, look how wonderful I am because I rescued that person. Woo! You know, pat me on the back. He's not really interested in there. And when they go on down the road and 6 months later, they're still dealing with trouble and they're still broken and they're still crying, he's telling them, get over it. I already rescued you, or she. I will tend to use he, she quite a bit. Women are capable of hurting men just as much as men are capable of it, but the statistics are that there are more men than women, so I do tend to use more gendered language, but just so you know, if I say he, it can be a her, okay? And vice versa. Everybody is a sinner and capable of sin. Dr. Romani, she is one of the leading American psychologists on narcissism. She estimates that 1 in 6 Americans have traits of narcissism. That's pretty high. And she says it is growing. Even more scary than narcissists are those with antisocial personality disorder, sometimes also, like we would call it, psychopaths. These people are born without the ability to feel that same range of emotion. So difference, right? Narcissists, they feel the same range of emotion, but for various circumstances, they have become incredibly selfish and don't know how to empathize with your feelings. Antisocial personality disorder, sociopaths, they're born without a part of their brain active, and they actually do not feel the same range of emotions that we do. Antisocial personality disorder is characterized by a long-term disregard for the feelings of others, often criminal behavior, but not always. Sociopathy, psychopath, and again, 3 to 1 are male to female. So unfortunately, still more guys than girls. I'm really sorry, guys. So based on this list, you might think that they're actually easier to spot, but sociopaths are really great at mirroring social norms. So you may have no idea that they don't feel the same range of emotions, even though they're incapable of it. Sociopaths have no regard whatsoever for the social contract because they do know how to use it to their advantage. This is Martha Stout. She is a leading psychologist, and she wrote the book, The Sociopath Next Door. Fabulous book. But she has done lots and lots of work and research with people with antisocial personality disorder. And she is the one that has estimated that we have 1 in 25 Americans with antisocial personality disorder or unable. That's pretty high. When I first heard that, it scared me. Because, you think, okay, a group of 25 people, one of them might be a sociopath. That's a pretty small number. Whew, freaked me out. Anna Salzer, she is the author of the book Predators. She writes, whenever sexual abuse occurs, there is an unwitting parent or a caregiver witnessing the performance that precedes the crime. Sex offenders only very rarely sneak into the house into the middle of the night. More often, they come through the front door as the friends and neighbors, as the Boy Scout leaders, the priests, the principals, the teachers, the doctors, the coaches. They are invited into our homes. Time after time, we give them permission to take our children. We give them permission because we do not recognize these people as predators, because we think sex offenders are monsters, and surely we would recognize a monster, wouldn't we? But predators are more common than we think. Another myth is that predators are power predators, that they're all about like this sudden violence, so they're easier to spot. Like, oh, they've offended. We know they've offended. Their attacks can be they cannot be easily labeled as misunderstandings, because it's pretty clear. You punched her in the face, like that kind of thing, like really clear. They strike when they feel certain success, that they're certain of success, and this is usually when they think this is usually what we think about when we talk about stranger danger. This is the misnomer. We think that most of them are like this, but they're not. Most predators qualify as persuasion predators. They carefully choose their victims. They are not just grooming the victim, they are grooming the entire community. And this is why the question is, well, something comes up, and how do we know? Well, because they've groomed you. And you're like, well, they're the good guy, right? In my situation, a story that I encountered, my former abuser, I was his second victim. I was his second wife. And I met him when he was still, I knew him before he married his first wife. But he had groomed us so well, his community so well, that anytime she showed up, raw as can be, she looked crazy. So when she finally left, everybody goes, oh, poor guy. And he's sitting there crying. Oh, my wife ran away. Oh, He looked, because he had groomed the entire community, and we all knew her to be crazy. She wasn't crazy. He looked like the calm one, and she looked like the volatile one. So, carefully choosing their victims, grooming the community. They test the water with low-risk strategies. They slowly isolate their target, and they depend on misplaced trust. I'm talking in this section about child predators, but this applies to all kinds of predators and abusers. This is what it looks like. They groom the community. They test out the small things, you know. What can they get away with? And it might start as simple as, you know, your husband or fiance or whatever goes from holding your hand to smacking your hand away, going, "Don't touch me." And that seems like really small. It's like just a little squabble, right? But he's testing. Are you going to talk to me? Like, why are you yelling at me? Or is there going to be a conversation, or are you just going to put, "Oh, I'm sorry. You know, your hand is sweaty. I can't stand it." Okay. And he's tested the waters, and now he can get away with that, and now he can do something bigger. And that seems really small, right? We're like talking about little things. But the next time, it might be, you know, throwing her across the room. But he's already tested, and he knows he can get away with it, and she's not going to tell anybody. And it seems really small and minor, but he's tested the waters. And then, did I miss? I think I might have missed a slide. But then they start to actually sexualize the relationship using small boundary violations with misunderstandings, and they maintain dominance. They use the long con. They gain the trust of the community. They fill a need. They form a special connection with the target, and they isolate them. So maybe you've got this family in need, and some person swoops in and meets that need. Is that important work that we need to do? Yeah. But you might also be aware, you know, it's like a single, lone, charming guy that's swooping in to save this family. Maybe we need to pay more attention to that. In a 2010 study entitled "How Clergy Sexual Misconduct Happens," they identified 6 characteristics that make our churches vulnerable to predators. Now, while the study focused on clergy sex abuse, it applies to all forms of predators, especially in small churches where, you know, we all get involved and we have different ministry positions. The church tends to ignore the warning signs. It's normalized, you know, some of these things were like, "Oh, he's just charming," or "Oh, he's just really cares about that family." We have this culture of niceness, and we don't like talking about the ugly, or, you know, we call it gossip. There's an ease of private communication. It's easy to like isolate somebody. There tends to be, especially in our smaller churches, a lack of oversight. People holding multiple roles, and the inherent trust in the sanctuary. Like, we trust the church. The church is supposed to be safe, and we forget that predators can end up inside our doors just as well as outside our doors. And so that makes us vulnerable. Truth is, it's really hard to identify predators, no matter where they are, and you probably even love them because you have no idea. But what do we do about it? I'm going to cover that more in the next presentation on Make It Safe, but here are a few things that you can do to minimize the risk. Be present. Don't leave your children alone, ever. Don't drop your kid off at the baseball game. Be there. Avoid all high-risk situations. Supervise all internet usage. I cannot tell you the levels of how easy it is for a predator to reach a child on the internet in the ways that like would boggle our minds. And if you think you're tech savvy, your 7-year-old is more tech savvy than you. Regularly check in with your children. Teach them to recognize their gut instinct, their gut feeling. Kids have these instincts. And give them full body autonomy. Teach them that they have the right to say no to any form of physical contact. Grandma wants a hug. 3-year-old says no. Okay. Is grandma dangerous? No. But when you tell that 3-year-old that doesn't feel like a hug her anyways, you are telling that 3-year-old she doesn't have full body autonomy. And while grandma might be safe, the next person isn't. Listen to and believe your child. If they find somebody is uncomfortable, do not force them to have contact. Period. They have a right to say no. A part of a healthy conscience is being able to confront consciencelessness. When you teach your daughter explicitly or by passive rejection that she must ignore her outrage and that she must be kind and accepting to the point of not defending herself or other people, that she must not rock the boat for any reason, you are not strengthening her pro-social sense. You are damaging it. And the first person she will stop protecting is herself. We have to teach our kids that it's okay to say no, and saying no is not necessarily rude. Now, we might want to teach them how to say no, right? And we might want to have conversations. Why do you feel that way? Why do you want to say no? But not to completely ignore it and just, oh, you just got to be nice. Just got to, everything's nice. Because unfortunately, we live in a very sinful world, and you can never reduce the risk to zero. But we can avoid many dangers, and we can empower our children with the tools they need so that they can navigate that. Mark 9:42 warns us that if you cause one of these little ones who trust in me to fall into sin, it would be better for you to be thrown into the sea with a large millstone around your neck. This is our sacred duty. We have to protect our children. And I encourage you, if you want to know more about this world and you are ready to dive in, the book Predators by Anna Salzer is a fabulous resource to understand the mind of a predator and how to keep your kids safe. Have I not been advancing? There we go. I guess I've got to check it more often, make sure that I'm hitting the right button. I apologize. Holler at me if it doesn't match what I'm saying. Wave at me. Hey, Caitlin, you're not making any sense. All right, so now we're going to talk more about domestic violence. And in this, I'm going to talk about some stats, but I also want to talk about what violence looks like.
Did it cover gaslighting at all?
Yes, to some extent. Yeah. And when we're done with this and we turn off the live stream, we can also have some conversation because we've got some time here to have some conversation between presentations. All right, so let's talk about domestic violence. But again, everything I'm talking about here can also apply to all other kinds of situations, like all other kinds of abuse. Parents can participate in similar forms of abuse with their children. You don't have to be married to the person. It could be a girlfriend. It could be a boyfriend. the same principles apply. All right, so let's start with some of these stats. 1 in 4 women and 1 in 7 men 18 and older have been a victim of severe physical violence by an intimate partner. That's pretty stark to me. Over 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men in the U.S. have experienced rape, physical violence, or stalking by an intimate partner. Almost half of women and men in the U.S. have experienced psychological aggression by an intimate partner, and gaslighting would be part of psychological aggression. More than 3 women are killed by their husbands or boyfriends every day. And family annihilation is on the rise. And unfortunately, our church stats aren't much different. In the book, Is It Abuse?, which is a Christian book on how to handle abuse, I highly recommend it. It's a great handbook for how to minister to the broken. It illustrates it this way. It says, if we can figure that a church has 160 women, so not that large of a church, 40 of those women will have experienced some sort of physical abuse in their lives, and 20 women will be currently experiencing physical violence, statistically. So if you've got 160 women, you'll have 20 being abused. That should be startling, because it's not okay. Where does it come from? You know, there's a pervasive myth in the church that if you do everything right, you marry the right person, and your relationship is magical, and you ride off into the sunset. Woohoo! That's what I believed. But Diane Langberg, the Christian psychologist, who, by the way, she is absolutely fabulous. Anything that Diane Langberg has written, read it. Christian psychologist who has dedicated her entire life to trauma. Says, you can do right and still have everything turn out wrong. I am not certain where we got the idea that it was so, given that the one that we follow and call God did do everything right and ended up being treated with gross injustice. So what is abuse? We've used these words, and why does it exist? Abuse is the ultimate entitlement to others. It is about stealing someone else's freedom. Domestic violence is not about cause and effect. It is about control. Abuse does not have anything to do with the victim, and we need to understand that. It has everything to do with the perpetrator and the state of his or her mind or soul. Abuse is not a symptom of an unhealthy marriage. It is a sign of the oppressor's self-worship. Abuse happens because the perpetrator worships himself more than anything else. In church, they had the video that said anything can become a god. They have become their own god. So let me illustrate it this way. Someone has a glass of water, and they're walking, and they trip, and water comes out. Why did the water come out? Was it because they tripped? Or was it because there was water in the glass? It's because there was water inside the glass. If they were carrying a cup of juice and they tripped, what would come out? Juice. So if you're full of self-worship, if you're full of sin and selfishness, and you bump up against something you don't like, what comes out? Sin and selfishness. It is about what's inside of them, not about the person that they bumped into or the person that bumped them. One of the things that you'll often happen is you'll see in a relationship that the people are both humans. And one of them is full of anger and self-worship, and the other one is also human, and that person makes a mistake and bumps the perpetrator, and but it's her fault because she bumped him, right? You are responsible for yourself. You are not responsible for anyone else's actions. The reality is, personal responsibility is key. It is key to preventing abuse. Both for the victim, you've got personal responsibility. You can't make him stop, but you can remove yourself from his sphere. And to the abuser, you are the only person that is responsible that there is water inside your cup that you have now poured all over the victim. Personal responsibility. Let's look at the different types of abuse. Now, this is the one that we're most familiar with. It's the one that's easiest to spot. Physical abuse. As you can see, it's really important to understand abuse because Satan uses it to destroy its victims and its perpetrators. That's the whole reason it exists, because Satan wants to destroy us. So what is physical abuse? Well, we're going to define physical abuse as it involves an intentional or recklessly using physical force in a way that may result in bodily injury or physical pain. That's how we'll define it today. Physical abuse doesn't actually have to leave a mark. It just has to cause pain or bodily, injury. There is no acceptable level of violence, period. We don't qualify, he hits her, but he doesn't leave bruises, so it's okay. No, it's not. Here's some examples of what physical violence looks like. This is not an exhaustive list. Slapping, choking, pinching, kicking, shoving, restraining, driving erratically, preventing sleep, regulating food, withholding medical treatment, limiting your movement, damaging your property. These are all physical violence. I want to remind you, again, physical abuse does not have to leave a mark, or it just has to be an intentional bodily harm. It involves intentional and recklessly using force that may result in bodily harm or physical pain. And here's the thing, too, is that physical damage doesn't always show up instantly. This past week, I just was at the doctor. I have been out of my abusive relationship since 2009, and my x-rays are showing continued degeneration of my lower spine due to what happened to me in my early 20s. And I will be in physical pain on some level for the rest of my life. So it doesn't always show up. And it's really easy to minimize. Let me tell you what, when I've told my story 1,000 times, I have minimized my physical violence because I'm okay. But the x-rays that I got this last week tell a totally different story. The tricky thing about identifying physical abuse is that it doesn't always continue either. Sometimes it only takes 1 or 2 examples for the victim to begin to toe the line. This is called conditioning. Conditioning violence is when the oppressor uses limited incidents of violence to establish a permanent fear or dominance. I think I have that in the slide. Early in her marriage, one woman decided to play a little fun trick that we do on our spouses. And she was in the car, and he was walking in front of the car, and she tooted her horn, and he was instantly beside her, and he punched the glass window right next to her head. He was never physically violent like that ever again, and she towed the line for the next 40 years. Over time, the violence often does escalate, from intimidation and threats to slapping and throwing you, to throwing objects, to punching, biting, kicking, beating, using weapons, and finally, homicide. But it doesn't have to follow this. It can go quickly. It can start here one day with an intimidation, and the next day she's dead. And we've had examples in the news of this. There was a couple years, I don't remember the last name, but it was Chris and Shanann, and it has come out that he was not a great husband behind the scenes, and it was like verbal, and there were problems. And one day he came home and he killed his wife, his unborn child, and his 2 daughters, and stuck them in barrels of oil. One day she thought they had a bad marriage. The next day she was gone. It doesn't have to be that, oh, well, it's not there yet. It can be instant. It doesn't always take time. If you or someone that you love is in a physically violent relationship, you want to work with caution. Because the most dangerous time for a victim to leave is when she's trying to leave. So you want to educate yourself. You want to call a domestic violence hotline. You want to make sure. This is why, and I was sharing with somebody in the lobby, if I work with somebody locally, if you want to work with me, you have to leave your cell phone behind or I won't work with you. Because there are myriads of ways, even if you wipe your phone, for them to still track you. And you have to be serious, because I don't want to be put in danger and I don't want you to be put in danger. So if you're willing to leave your phone behind, I know you're ready to leave him. Oops, wrong direction. So the Lundy Bancroft, he's an author and domestic violence consultant, and he actually runs workshops with perpetrators, trying to help them recover. So he knows them. This is what he writes. Your abusive partner doesn't have a problem with his anger. He has a problem with your anger. One of the basic human rights that he takes away from you is the right to be angry with him. No matter how badly he treats you, he believes that your voice shouldn't rise and your blood shouldn't boil. The privilege of rage is reserved for him alone. Sexual violence, sexual abuse. This is the next type. It's another one that we're really familiar with. We're like, okay, we know what that looks like. Or at least we think we do. And this one can be particularly insidious in religious communities, as the scriptures can be weaponized to justify it. But sexual abuse is an affront to the character of God. Full stop. What is sexual abuse? Sexual abuse is any act of sexual nature that violates the sexual integrity of another person. It is important to keep in mind that abusive relationships often involve different layers. So 40 to 45% of verbally and physically abusive marriages also have forced sex. Doesn't matter they're married, that is still violence. In fact, 10 to 14% of all marriages, of all abusive marriages, have involved marital rape. And according to the Coalition of Domestic Violence, the act of rape causes the highest degree of physical injury when it is perpetrated by an intimate partner, not a stranger. And it is more likely to have occurred multiple times. For example, a woman I once worked with escaped her abusive marriage after 2 weeks. It was that bad. She ran in 2 weeks. Yet, the sexual damage that was done to her during those 2 weeks has left her emotionally handicapped with PTSD and overwhelming anxiety years out. 2 weeks. Many Christian women are told that they need to endure the sexual abuse. But sexual abuse is not about what the woman has or hasn't done. It's because the oppressor loves himself. Sexual abuse in a marriage is driven by a desire to dominate and by delight in someone else's pain. And so when a woman is being told there's a problem in your marriage, or he's unfaithful, or whatever it is because you're not giving him enough, what you are telling her is that she is not worth much. And the Bible backs this up. 1 Thessalonians 4, verses 3 to 4 says, "For this is the will of God, you sanctify, that you abstain from sexual immorality, and that each one of you know how to control his own body in holiness and honor." So again, we're circling back to personal responsibility. You want to prevent abuse? Teach personal responsibility. So what violates the sexual integrity of another person? Unrelenting pressure, callous disregard, unwanted intrusions, any unwanted acts, coercion. She says no, he keeps talking to her, she says no again, and it goes on for hours, and finally she's like, fine. That is sexual violence. Degradation, jealous accusation, technological abuses, and threats and punishment. Again, this is not a comprehensive list. But as a society, we're beginning to recognize this area of abuse. Nationally, marital rape was only recognized in 93. And even then, most states still rarely took it seriously. In Tennessee, it wasn't recognized until 2005. And even then, only if it involved a weapon or extreme bodily harm. So if she's married and he didn't hold a gun to her head, it's okay. Emotional abuse. Now we're getting into the harder to recognize. So we've already covered the most recognized. Emotional abuse can be a lot harder to pinpoint, but let's start by defining it. What is it? Well, emotional abuse can be called mental or verbal or psychological abuse, and it is a pattern of behavior that promotes a destructive sense of fear, obligation, shame, or guilt in a victim. Most tactics used in coercive control or emotional abuse have no legal standing and are rarely identified with abuse and are almost never targeted by intervention programs. So sometimes some people say to me, well, what can we do as a church? What should we do? It sounds like we should just call the cops. Sometimes there's nothing the cops can do. And the only thing that can be done is somebody being willing to listen and tell them, it is not okay. Your feelings are valid. You have every right to be upset because he calls you horrific names and he tells you you're stupid and he degrades you. And, it sounds like a fight, but when every day you get called names and told you're dumb and you're worthless and you're fat and you're stupid and you're ugly, that is abuse, and it's a physical injury in your brain. As many as 20% of relationships where domestic violence is present, there might be no physical abuse at all. And that's what makes it really tricky. He's never hit me, but I'm dying. Emotional abuse is one of the easiest to hide. It can be quiet and almost imperceivable. Like the husband who used to come up behind his wife whenever she was in the kitchen and whisper to her how stupid and worthless she was, where no one else could hear. But all they saw was her reaction. So they thought, oh, he's going in to be loving. But in her ear, he is telling her how worthless she is. Or the husband who would swear and insult his wife all the way to church where he would preach. The Bible warns us about the consequences of emotional abuse. In James 3, verse 5, it says, likewise, the tongue is a small part of the body, and it makes great boasts. Consider what a great forest is set on fire by a little spark. A tongue can kill. Here are some things where emotional abuse shows up. Neglect, indifference, frightening them, isolating them, cruelty, like belittling, threatening, terrorizing, degrading, mind games, like gaslighting, She starts to question her reality. He calls her a name. She starts to cry. She's still crying a minute later, and he turns to her and goes, why are you crying? Well, you just called me his name. What are you talking about? You called me that name. Why are you crying? I should be the one crying. And then she's like, wait, there are two of us in the car. I swear it was you. And that sounds crazy, right? It's crazy. But when that happens to you every day, you start going, am I crazy? What is really happening here? I heard someone say that that how vocal a woman is about her abuse indicates whether she is truly a victim. That is completely untrue. Some victims suffer in silence. Some know things were wrong and they speak up. But no matter where someone falls on that spectrum, their trauma is still valid. Some victims are loud. Some victims are running around going, "Do you see what he's doing to me?" It may make them look a little crazy, but they're desperate for help, and some of them are quiet. It doesn't mean that every single person who claims abuse is being honest. I want to be very clear. False accusations do happen. They are rare. The last statistics that I saw on false accusations of like rape collected by the FBI said something like 5% or less are false. Does that make those false accusations any less devastating? No. But when you're going into how likely it is for someone to come and admit to you, "I'm being hurt, I'm being abused," it comes with so much shame. It can be really, really hard to share that, especially in the religious community. So when someone says, "I'm being hurt," take them seriously. I say listen and investigate, right? Believe and investigate. The truth is, the scars from mental cruelty can be as deep and as long-lasting as the wounds from a punch or a slap, but they are often not as obvious. And in fact, even among women who have experienced violence from a partner, half or more report that the man's emotional abuse is what is causing them the greatest harm. Let's look at spiritual abuse. Spiritual abuse is perhaps one of the most overlooked forms of abuse, but it has devastating consequences that take years to unwind. Spiritual abuse is when someone weaponizes the scriptures or doctrine to hurt, scare, or control you. And it is diametrically opposite to God's character, diametrically opposed. Jesus called out spiritual abuse in Matthew 23, 13 to 34, where he gives a long list of abuses during his day, and he closes off the kingdom of God, leading believers down the wrong path, twisting technicalities to get their own desires, stealing and manipulating the vulnerable, greedy and indulgent, and much more. Jesus called out spiritual abuse. But unfortunately, it can be really subtle and deeply confusing. So let's look at some examples. Overemphasis on authority. And I'm sure you can think of many of examples of where somebody has been almost like a deified to control and tell another person what to do. In a lot of conservative communities, this comes in the form of male-dominated, well, he's a man, therefore he knows what's right, tells you what to do. You don't have a choice. Being an image conscious. So you are hiding things at church so people don't know what's really going on in your life. Paranoid, suppressing criticism, theologically being imbalanced, having a different standard for themselves than others. I can do this, you can't. They're unteachable, legalistic, resistant to authority, like others having authority over them. So a young woman, after disclosing abuse to her in-laws, was brought into their home for a Bible study so that she could be shown how it didn't matter what their son did, she could never leave him. Or the woman who was told that it didn't matter how hard she tried to please her husband. She was repeatedly told that she was such a bad person, Satan must have sent her to ruin her husband's life. So spiritual abuse often has devastating consequences in a person's life because they misunderstand salvation. They completely lose sight. And this is why many victims walk out of our doors and never come back. They struggle to separate the idea of abuse from God because they see God as authoritarian. Or maybe if their father was the abuser and we called God their father, they have a hard time seeing God as a father because their dad was abusive. And they're consumed by false guilt because we are really good at laying on the shame. One young girl that I became acquainted with several years ago, well, I've had a few of them, she became an atheist because she just could not come to grips with God and what happened to her. The story that finally broke her was when her preacher preached a sermon on Judges chapter 11, the story of Jephthah. And you may recall, Jephthah goes to war and says, I'll sacrifice to you, God, whatever is the first thing to come out of the door. And what comes out of the door? His daughter. And the preacher said, this was a case of God condoning human sacrifice. And she said, well, if that's a God, I don't want to believe in him. And she never came back. If you got questions about that story as a result of that encounter, I have dove deep into that story. It is not a story of human sacrifice. Do not tell your children that. God is a God of love. He does not believe in human sacrifice. All right. This is our final one, financial abuse. This is so tricky. But here's what financial abuse is. Financial abuse is a way of controlling a person by making her or him economically dependent or exploiting her or his resources. 99% of domestic violence situations involve financial abuse. And this is where we as a one of the places we as a community can come in. Because if the girl or the woman is so strapped that she literally cannot walk out the door, we can help connect them with resources or help provide for them in some ways. Maybe she just can't leave because she can't afford diapers. Well, could we rally around her and buy her diapers? Yeah, we could, right? It's an inordinate burden. Maybe he took away her career and she hasn't been able to work. Can we help her find a job? Can we help her find housing? These are things that we can do. And finances are really hard because if you don't have money or the ability to make money, you're increasingly isolated. I had a client who was an immigrant and her husband refused to file the paperwork so that she could get a job. He married her, but he wouldn't help her file the paperwork to get the green card so that she could get a job. So she couldn't leave him. So she's stuck in a trailer in the middle of the woods, only able to get groceries when he decides to drive her and her son to the grocery store. It's like a magnifying glass that just expands the abuse that she's already experiencing. If you've ever questioned how God feels about financial abuse, here's 1 Timothy 5:8. It says, "But if anyone who does not provide for his relatives, especially for the members of his household, he has denied the faith and he is worse than an unbeliever." Here are some of the ways that financial abuse can be manifest. Financial neglect. The guy that can afford to but refuses to buy coats for his kids. Limiting access to medical or mental health care. Unmet basic needs. Restricting self-care. Isolating from social events, such as being able to see your family. Oh, we can't afford the gas for you to drive to see your mom. Limiting access to personal credit. Or racking up debt in her name. If I leave, I've got $20,000 worth of debt that he put on my credit card because he filed for a credit card in my name that I didn't consent to. One woman was given a small allowance every 2 weeks to cover food, gas, clothing, music lessons, school, and all household needs. And if she asked her husband to pick up something on the way home, like, oh, honey, we're out of bread, would you pick up the bread? He would come home and demand that she paid him back for the bread. Another time, after this husband went and spent $3,000 on a suit, she thought, I think we must be in a good enough situation I can buy a new dress for church. I haven't had a new dress in like 3 years. So she decided to take $60 and she went to the store and she bought herself a dress. And for that selfish act, she was horrifically punished. Beware of self-pity. When a woman or a man, when a victim gets the courage to leave, often the abuser starts showing remorse. Oh, I got caught, I'm losing, and then, you know what we do as a community? He said he's sorry, he's repenting, give him a chance. But often this is not actual repentance, this is self-pity. He's sorry that he's lost something. When we recognize that abuse may be part of your story, the tears and apology may actually be further control. After repeated infidelity, financial exploitation, and abuse, one woman was preparing to leave her husband when he had a complete change of heart. He came to her telling how ashamed he was of the way he had treated her. He realized that he had squandered their marriage, and he told her a list of exactly what he was going to do to rectify all of this. He told her all the things she'd been waiting to hear. As a part of his effort to take responsibility for his abuse, the husband found a job on the other side of the country, closer to his family, but thousands of miles from hers. And there the isolation and violence grew, and her final escape took several more years and much more effort because he'd repented. Here are the effects of abuse, or some of them, and why it should matter to you. Abuse means faith struggles, because the victim goes, I believed in God, I did everything right, and this happened. It's shame. She doesn't want to tell you her life is hell. Depression, anxiety, PTSD, sleep issues, suicidal ideations, trust issues, eating disorders, volatility, hypervigilance, victim guilt, disoriented, muscle tension, involuntary shaking, fatigue, menstrual cycles, and fertility issues, much more. This is really important. The Bible tells us, take no part in the unfaithful works of the darkness, but instead expose them, for it is shameful even to speak of the things that they do in secret. But when anything is exposed by the light, it becomes visible. Ephesians 5:11-13. And today we're doing some of that. We are calling out what happens in the darkness. So if you're a victim, or if you support a victim, or if you want to make yourself available to support others, just know victims don't always recognize what's happening to them, and sometimes they don't even tell you. Be prepared to have to ask them again and again and again. One time somebody told me, if a victim hasn't lied to you, you haven't been doing this for very long. Now, that didn't mean that they intended to lie to you, but they might not, the first time you ask, has he ever hit you? They might say no, and he is hitting them. Because maybe you didn't ask it the right way. You said, has he ever hit you? Well, no, he hasn't. He's kicking her. So you have to keep asking. They don't have context for what's happening. So you've got to share with them what safety looks like. If you've recognized any of this as your own story or your friends, I want you to know that you can reach out to me. You can connect to the Abide Network if you want to talk to someone else. It's abide.network, actually spelled out. That's the web address, abide.network. Or you can go to my website, braverstill.com, and you can message me. It's just important that you talk to someone. So today, if you recognize abuse and trauma are bigger issues than you previously understood, I appeal to you to educate yourself, because that is what education is, prevention. And it will prepare you to be more empathetic. When someone comes and tells you their story, you will be prepared and less shocked. Because let me tell you, when you come to somebody and your reality is chaos and you think you're sharing like a little tiny detail and it's really a big bad one, and the person goes, whoa! You're like, oh, I'm not going to share anymore. Maybe I'm the crazy one. Abuse is happening in your community. Just like, go back to that statistic. At the very beginning of churches, 160 women, 20 are actively being abused. It's around you. Become more aware. Ask questions. Don't be afraid to challenge. Let's see, I think that's actually... Oh, one last thing. I'm not a victim. I'm a survivor. I'm a warrior. Somebody did mention to me last night that they had listened to my testimony. If you want to listen to my testimony, my story, it's not necessarily, I've shared pieces. You can go to my website, braverstill.com. You can scroll down